From 1978 to 1995, in a bombing campaign that lasted nearly 2 decades, 16 makeshift bombs were sent throughout the United States, killing 3 and injuring another 23. These heinous acts of terrorism were carried out by one man, Theodore Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber. But Ted wasn't some crazed lunatic sending out bombs for the sake of killing. No, he was meticulous in his planning and was self-justified in his acts of terrorism. Ted was also, without a doubt, a genius. He had an IQ level higher than that of Einstein's and studied at Harvard from the age of 16. When I first heard about the story of Ted, I wondered how someone who got their education from arguably the most prestigious educational institution in the world could go so wrong later in their life. My name is Justin Yoon, and today I would like to talk to you about the shortcomings of our modern education. In our modern day society, education is quite linear. Children are taught to attend elementary school, middle school, high school, and get admitted to college. This societal standard is taken as a norm in our industrial society. And most people can't even consider veering off from this road since they're taught from such a young age that it's what you should do. But let's get this straight. I'm not saying that going to college is a bad thing. Actually, it's quite the opposite. If you don't have a clear goal of what you want to do in the future, it's often a safe bet to study for college and to figure it out as you go. It can also serve as a strong tool to land yourself a stable job in the future. However, in the push for academic excellence, parents, educators, and institutions often overlook the physical and mental health of these students just to put academic excellence above all. Even parental education is often overlooked, since in low-income families, both parents have to get a job to support their family. And students under pressures like these often sacrifice other aspects of their lives, such as hobbies, social life, sleep, and even their health to pursue academic success. These children are often blindsided to their own dreams and oblivious to what they actually want to do because they're taught to pursue good grades. In some other cases, they're even forced to sacrifice their own dreams for the desires of their parents. Theodore John Kaczynski was born in Chicago on May 22nd, 1942. He was brought into a relatively normal working-class family and was introduced to his little brother, David, a couple years later. Now, in his early childhood, Ted had a fairly normal life. He was described by his teachers as a healthy, well-adjusted boy that plays well with other children in his neighborhood. And he had multiple friends throughout this period whom he often hung out with. And in his own words, Ted described how he even showed leadership on a few occasions. Like on this one occasion, he organized a carnival event with his friends and made a small profit from selling the tickets to kids in the neighborhood. But Ted wasn't subject to great parental education in his early days. Although living in a working-class neighborhood, he recalls that his parents looked down upon the neighbors and considered themselves a cut above the rest. Later, Ted wrote that this behavior from his parents was the first sign of significant social difficulties for him. as his family was so different from the rest of the neighborhood. Although not everything was smooth sailing for Ted, this era of his life was described, even by Ted, as a healthy period for his physical and spiritual health. During grade 5, Ted still had multiple friends and even a female partner he was being flirtatious with. Ted even goes on to say that the relationship would have undoubtedly led to love. Unfortunately, certain circumstances weren't too nice to him. While he was still in 5th grade, Ted took an IQ test and scored 167, which was well into genius territory. Following this, he was encouraged by his advisor to skip 6th grade, a decision that his parents were more than happy to go through with. However, Ted later said skipping 6th grade was a disaster for him, and that he began to have serious problems with social adjustment from that point on. The 7th graders, whom Ted was put in class with, did not approve of him. And Ted quickly slid into the role of an outcast. He was often isolated and was subject to insults and bullying by the dominant boys in his class. And with humiliating results when making advancements to girls during this period, he later found approaching women difficult even after the age of 30. Later, even the administrator at the school admitted to the failure of skipping students ahead in grades, which he also mentioned was an experiment. He stated that kids who skipped grades ended up as outcasts, and that the students were basically set up for failure. And this practice of relentless push for academic progress while having little consideration for the health of the students is something that most definitely continues to this day. And it's something that will definitely continue to plague our educational system. Now, by high school, Ted still had some friends, but he was mostly keeping to himself since he skipped grades. The continued pressure from his parents and academic advisors made Ted skip his junior year in high school and take on summer school to finish high school even faster. And Ted was unable to get along with his older classmates, and the isolation was taking a toll on his social life. As his classmate once said, he was never really seen as a person, as an individual personality. He was always regarded as a walking brain, so to speak. By this point, Ted had grown hateful towards his parents and academic advisors for all the pressure they gave him to perform. And he even stated, quote, "I took no pride in my grades and resented the school. So a couple of times I did cheat on exams. I never felt ashamed of this." Nonetheless, Ted showed incredible intellect and academic prowess. And as one of the school's 5 national merit finalists, Ted was encouraged to apply to Harvard University. And he was admitted at just 15 years old with a scholarship. However, his time at Harvard didn't help alleviate his social isolation in the slightest. Ted said that he was overwhelmed by the pressure to perform, and that the fact that he was all alone from his family at just the age of 16, and also Ted stayed in one of the residential houses at Harvard, meant for juvenile students, where his social isolation only got worse. Other students described the house as being a very lonely place. Students would often spend all their time studying in their rooms and only leaving to attend classes or get food. Now, this makes sense since all the students in these houses were prodigies in their own respect. Now, during his time at Harvard, Ted continued to excel academically. However, he continued to struggle with his social circumstances, and he started to build a philosophy to express his hate for society. He was also a participant in a psychological study led by Professor Henry A. Murray, with the main objective of finding out what it takes to break down a highly intelligent individual mentally. The experiment involves asking the participants to write essays, verbally abusing them about the essays, and finding out what it takes to break them down mentally, which all took place over the span of 3 years. During the experiment, they would use interrogation techniques that would be considered unethical in today's standards. Ted later stated that he resented the study and the people involved in it. He described the study as, quote, the worst experience of my life. Ted graduated from Harvard with a bachelor's degree in mathematics and was offered a student professor position at the University of Michigan, where he subsequently pursued his postgraduate studies. But Ted wasn't quite fond of his mathematical studies either. Instead, he continued to study in mathematics in fear of getting drafted, which was a very real concern because this was the 60s. After finishing his studies at Michigan, Ted went on to become the youngest assistant professor in Berkeley's history. However, Ted's students at Berkeley stated that he seemed uncomfortable in teaching and that he taught straight from the book and refused to answer any questions. This behavior from Ted is most certainly a product of his isolated education that he experienced for his entire life. As a result of Ted's lifelong social isolation, he quit his job at Berkeley and decided to move to the woods, where he can be alone and away from society. He built himself a small cabin and lived without running water or electricity. Ted also came up with a philosophy on why society was failing, as he believed that technology was the problem plaguing society. Starting in 1978, from his cabin in Montana, Ted started to send package bombs to people who he believed were key players in promoting industrial growth, such as computer scientists, lumber lobbyists, and college professors. His spree continued and eluded FBI agents for nearly 2 decades. The bombing campaign came crashing down for Ted when he threatened media companies to publish his manifesto about his philosophy on society. The media obliged and published the text in the newspapers. Soon after, Ted's brother David recognized the writing style and reported his brother to the authorities. Ted was tracked down in his Montana cabin and arrested in 1996. He was sentenced to 8 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and Ted died in his cell on June 10th, 2023. I think it's clear to us what we should take away from Ted's story. Modern education feels extremely one-lane-like in its nature. And students are often told to do their best to reach the end of this road as fast as they can. And those who are put under pressure by their family or school to do so often end up with long-term social consequences and isolation during their academic years. Now, TED is just one extreme example of how pressures from modern education can erode students' mental health. The Korean math prodigy Kim Yoon is another example of such case. Kim scored a 210 on an IQ test from a very young age. And from that point on, he was basically forced into the life of a prodigy. He worked at NASA from the age of 11 for 5 years, a period that he described as the most hellish period of his life. A report by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in 2019 have stated that studies of students in high-achieving schools have consistently determined that these students show rates of mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and rule breaking at a much higher rate than the national norm. These pressures and social difficulties are not just limited to prodigies, but extends down to ordinary students as well. And they can leave permanent marks on their futures. Perhaps it's time for us to reconsider the everyday education we take for granted and look for a more open-ended way to educate our future generations. We shouldn't be expecting our students to tolerate environments that they naturally find intolerable. Thank you.